Here we are, Chapter 2, titled The Young Republic. Today we're going to talk a little bit about George Washington, the second presidency, and with the election of 1800 and the issue that's going to be the Electoral College at this time period. So a little bit about this chapter. This is one that is very, very broad because we'll start with the summer of 1789, as I said, talking about George Washington, and we're going to finish with the beginning of the Civil War. So there's a lot of history to talk about. We're going to talk about the highlights. Make sure you remember and understand those big important details. So let's kind of get right into it. First slide, known as the early years. So one thing that's a little bit odd at this time period, as I said, 1789 is when we're going to be starting here. Congress actually meets and gets together before the Constitution is even ratified. Last time we had a video, we talked about the ratification, how that was a difficult process. But Congress, they pretty much figured that it would take place eventually. Eventually, enough people would get on board because the Articles of Confederation was such an issue. And on top of that, they realized they elected George Washington as president. Now, he had been someone who had been very famous up until this point dealing with the Revolutionary War. Now, to put him as the president, they realized the country was going to be in good hands. So, anyways, Washington as a president. Things are a little bit different back then as they are today dealing with the presidency. Today, President Trump wakes up, has meetings pretty much throughout the entire day. They work very long hours. Washington, his schedule was a little bit more relaxed. So much to the point that on afternoons, oftentimes, he would have meet and greets. You could go to the White House, you could meet the president, you could discuss certain issues. He would have tea parties, you had to be an invited guest, but nonetheless, the presidency was a lot more open back then. Pretty much he set a lot of different precedents, such as he's only going to be president for 8 years. Most other presidents are going to follow along with those lines until we get to FDR. But anyways, kind of talk about what he did as president. The first thing that he has to do is he has to figure out what this executive branch is going to all be about. And one thing he does, he puts together the first presidential cabinet. Now, that's a term we're going to use a lot throughout the year. A presidential cabinet, all it simply is, this is the group of advisors that he wants. As you see, two of the most famous people on there, Thomas Jefferson is going to be known as the Secretary of State. Alexander Hamilton, he is going to be the Treasury Secretary. Now, his secretary back then, he only had 3 people. Today, there are 16 members of the presidential cabinet. So you can just kind of see, talking about the numbers, how that's going to be a big difference from the 3 versus the 16 there. But he puts together this first presidential cabinet, and it's almost a little bit strange because he picks people who are going to kind of butt heads here. Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, they do not get along. But he wants to push past that. We'll talk about George Washington. He does not believe in political parties. He thinks that these factions are going to destroy American society. So he picks people that he thinks are going to be great leaders that know a lot about that specific position, but ultimately they are going to start to butt heads here. So he's going to put them together. Also, the early years of the presidency. The Judiciary Act of 1789 outlines the makeup of the Supreme Court and the lower courts. And you probably think, yes, in the Constitution, we already have it set up who's going to be what as far as the Supreme Court's going to be concerned. But Supreme Court early on is almost like an afterthought. So Congress gets together, they lay out the Judiciary Act. John Jay, he is going to be selected as the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And I know it kind of went through this fast, but really there's not that much to do as a president at this time period. Washington, he only vetoes 2 laws. He really agrees with what Congress is doing. Probably the other major event that took place was something that's known as the Whiskey Rebellion. At this time period, just like today, we have direct taxes. He is going to raise taxes. I shouldn't say that. Congress is going to raise taxes on whiskey. People are going to become upset about it. There's going to be a rebellion. He has 13,000 soldiers. He leads them into battle to make sure that they're going to put that down. But that's going to be the early years as the presidency of Washington. Now, the next thing that just is still an issue is going to be the financial problems within the United States. Now, today, we are massively in debt. The same thing is going to be true at this time period in the early 1700s and late 1800s. The Continental Congress, they were in massive debt. They had to pay off a war. They had to figure out how to get supplies, how to get soldiers, how to get food. So they spent a lot of money. Now that we have this Constitution, and again, under the Articles of Confederation, they couldn't raise money this way. They couldn't ask for taxes. So now with this Constitution, they are going to be able to do so. But anyways, Alexander Hamilton, being the Secretary of the Treasury, he calls for a national bank. And the reason he wants a national bank, he thinks it is going to help out with managing the country's finances. But just like today, with these political parties, just like any law, you're not going to get 100% of the people behind it. People are going to be upset with it. So Alexander Hamilton, his supporters, they're going to end up calling themselves the Federalists. Jefferson and his supporters, they're going to be known as the Democratic Republicans. And the reason that Jefferson, they are so much against this, Jefferson believes in very, very limited federal government. So much to the point, he thinks that the government should be hands off of it. It should almost be laissez-faire. Now, by Alexander Hamilton saying that we need to create a national bank who's going to be in charge of all the finances, to him that's the Federalists taking too much power. So Jefferson initially pulls out the Constitution and says, specifically, you cannot do this. It does not say that you have the power to create a national bank. Hamilton comes back and says, we have what's known as the Necessary and Proper Clause. Anything that is necessary and proper for the United States, Congress has the authority to create that. So they are going to butt heads here. Eventually, Alexander Hamilton, he is going to win. They are going to get the national bank, but there's still going to be a lot of compromises that have to take place there. So this is going to be kind of that first time period where we're starting to tackle some of those financial troubles. Now, as I said, Washington, he, I don't know if you really want to say that he didn't want to be president, but he did not want the presidency to turn into a dictatorship. And what I mean by that, he did not think that someone should be president year after year, possibly being in charge for decades. So after those 8 years, he takes a step back. He is no longer going to be the president. So our second president is going to be John Adams. So as it says, tough times ahead for Adams. John Adams takes over as president. And early on into his presidency, France, they want to go to war with the United States. And this almost looks a little bit odd because when we talk about the Revolutionary War, France, they were our oldest and they were our strongest ally. But the United States, we signed a treaty with the British. So because we signed that treaty with the British, and I don't know if we were playing both sides here, but we wanted to make sure that we were friends with both the French and the British. The French, they were not on board with that. So because we signed a treaty with the British, they were close to declaring war with the United States. And because we start to have this separation with what should happen with the war here, also with the rise of political parties, there is a ton of segregation within Congress. And when I say segregation, that's you have the Federalists, that's you have the Democratic Republicans. So to make sure that the Federalists were going to be in charge and keep them in power, he is going to create these new laws that are going to start to take away some of the freedoms that we have here in the United States. Those are known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. And we'll look at them and you'll probably think as I go over this that this is pretty much cut and dry taking away from the First Amendment. So the first one here, you cannot print anything false, scandalous, or malicious against the government. It also goes on to say that you cannot utter anything like that as well. So if you don't like this Alien and Sedition Act, technically speaking, you cannot be vocal against it. You cannot say that you do not support it. Now, false, scandalous, okay, I kind of agree with that. If you're going to print something in the media, it should be true. You should not make up rumors. But by taking away First Amendment rights, well, that's going to be a big negative for him. And the second thing, he also makes it difficult to become a citizen. And you're probably questioning, why would he care about that? But the people who were immigrants at this time period, the people who were newly coming over to the United States, they were not supporting John Adams. They were not supporting the Federalists. So by making it difficult to become a citizen, pretty much going to make sure that he is going to remain in power here. And the last one that we're going to do, the election of 1800. Now this is going to reveal a big flaw in the system. But John Adams won this first term, wants to run again. But the Alien and Sedition Acts basically are going to make it impossible for him to be able to win here. So John Adams is going to run, but he is going to run against Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson does something a little bit different in this election cycle. He runs with a vice president. Up until this point, if you took second place, you were the new vice president. So the example of this time period, that would be like we would have a President Trump and Vice President Hillary Clinton. You know, those two kind of butting heads, it probably would not work out here. So Thomas Jefferson, he is going to run with a running mate, and he is going to be known as Aaron Burr. But as I said, the election is going to reveal a flaw in the system. Because yes, it was close, but Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, they were not the winner. But Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, they were viewed as the winners. And the flaw that we're going to have here is people do not directly vote for president. Same today. Here in North Dakota, if you voted for President Trump, that went for his electoral college votes. So the question I'll ask you, do you have to have the popular vote in order to become the president? And as I go around in class, I'll ask each and every one of you this question. But think about that for tomorrow. But anyways, back to the election of 1800. So, as Jefferson and Burr won, all of a sudden now it comes down to the electoral college. And someone made a big, glaring, ginormous, massive mistake. I don't know, I can't fathom enough, or can't talk enough about how big this mistake was. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr both had 73 electoral votes. Someone was told, do not vote for Aaron Burr, just give a blank ballot. That way it's 73 and 72. But with both of them having 73 electoral votes, who should be president? Technically speaking, at this time period, they are tied. Jefferson, it was known that he wanted to be president. It was known that Aaron Burr should be vice president. But Jefferson, well, he didn't really get along with a lot of people who were in Congress at this time period. So it was almost viewed, and there's kind of these rumors that Thomas Jefferson eventually, he compromised. And he said that he would keep the national bank. And by him keeping the national bank, on the next ballot, someone left their ballot blank, and Thomas Jefferson comes out as the winner. Now this does two things. The first one, I don't have the first one listed on here, so but it's still important. The first thing is it shows that you can have a peaceful transition of power. Here we have a new political party taking over. Both sides disagreed on the national bank, but by Jefferson kind of conceding here, saying that we'll keep the national bank, it shows that you have that peaceful transition of power. And then the second thing, this also leads to the 12th Amendment. Today, if you voted for President Trump, you also casted a ballot for Vice President Pence. So we have these separate votes for President and Vice President as the 12th Amendment. So again, I always bring it up. Make sure, quick summary on the bottom of your Cornell notes. I'll check those tomorrow and make sure you have a question proposed so we can have that discussion in class.